when a quiet Amish girl faces relentless bullying in the harsh Wyoming territory of 1,867. She believes she's destined to live as an outcast forever. But when a mysterious rancher steps out of the shadows to defend her honor, their unexpected alliance ignites a love story that will challenge everything both communities believe about acceptance and belonging. Will their forbidden connection survive the violent confrontation that threatens to tear them apart forever? The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cheyenne as Rebecca Yoder clutched her basket tighter, knowing that each step toward the general store would bring fresh torment. Her plain black dress and simple bonnet marked her as different in this rough Wyoming territory town, where even the poorest women wore colorful ribbons and brass buttons to show they belonged. The wooden boardwalk creaked under her careful steps as she passed the saloon, where men in dusty work clothes already nursed their first drinks of the day. Their conversation stopped when they noticed her, replaced by whispered comments and muffled laughter that made her cheeks burn with shame. She kept her eyes fixed on the weathered boards beneath her feet, counting each plank to distract herself from their stares. "Look what's coming down the street," called out Pete Morrison, the blacksmith's apprentice. His voice carried the cruel edge that young men used when they wanted to impress their friends. "Another one of them strange people who think they're better than the rest of us." Rebecca's fingers found the smooth wooden prayer beads hidden in her pocket, a gift from her mother back in Pennsylvania. The familiar texture gave her strength as she remembered her mother's words. "Sometimes being different is the greatest gift God can give us, even when it feels like a burden." The general store's painted sign swayed in the morning breeze, promising supplies and necessities to those who could afford them. Rebecca needed black thread to mend her father's work shirt, but the simple task felt like walking into a den of wolves. She had learned in her 3 months in Cheyenne that even buying basic supplies could become an ordeal when you didn't fit in. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the familiar hush fell over the customers inside. Mrs. Martha Henderson, the banker's wife, stood near the fabric display with her usual circle of friends. Their silk dresses and feathered hats seemed to shimmer in the morning light streaming through the windows, making Rebecca feel even more plain and out of place. "Well, well," Martha's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "If it isn't one of our peculiar neighbors, I wonder what brings her to town today." Rebecca approached the counter, where Mr. Patterson, the nervous store owner, pretended to organize his inventory. His thinning hair was damp with sweat despite the cool morning air, and he avoided looking directly at her face. She had noticed how differently he treated her compared to his other customers, always hurried and uncomfortable, as if her presence might somehow contaminate his store. "I need black thread, please," Rebecca said softly, her voice barely audible above the whispered conversations around her. She placed 2 coins on the wooden counter, payment for the small spool that would help her family through another week. "Black thread for black hearts," someone giggled from Martha's group. "What do you suppose they do with all that dark cloth? Probably practicing some kind of witchcraft." The accusation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her people were peaceful, devoted to God and hard work, yet these women spoke of them as if they were dangerous criminals. She bit her lip to keep from responding, knowing that defending herself would only make things worse. Patterson's hands shook as he glanced between Rebecca and his other customers. His loyalty clearly lay with those who spent more money in his store, the women who bought expensive fabrics and unnecessary trinkets. Rebecca watched his internal struggle, hoping he would choose basic human decency over profit. "I'm sorry, miss," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're all out of black thread today. Maybe you could try again next week?" Rebecca's heart sank as she noticed the spool of black thread sitting directly behind him on the shelf, its dark surface seeming to mock her from across the counter. She had expected this treatment, but it still hurt every time it happened. The coins felt heavy in her palm as she prepared to leave empty-handed once again. "How convenient," Martha said with false sweetness. "Perhaps it's God's way of telling certain people they're not welcome in civilized establishments." The words stung more than Rebecca cared to admit. She had grown up believing that God loved all his children equally. But Martha's version of faith seemed to have room for only certain types of people. The contradiction between what she had been taught and what she experienced daily in Cheyenne made her question everything she thought she knew about human nature. As she turned to leave, Rebecca caught sight of her reflection in the store's window. The young woman staring back at her looked tired and defeated. Her shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make herself smaller. When had she become so afraid of the world? When had her natural confidence been replaced by this constant need to apologize for existing? The bell chimed again as she reached for the door handle, but instead of the welcoming sound of her exit, it announced someone else's arrival. Rebecca paused, her hand frozen on the brass handle, as a tall shadow filled the doorway behind her. "Afternoon, ladies," a deep voice said, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the store turn and take notice. "Mr. Patterson." Rebecca didn't turn around, but she could feel the change in the room's atmosphere. The whispered conversations stopped completely, replaced by an electric tension that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Even Martha Henderson's group fell silent, their earlier confidence suddenly replaced by something that looked almost like nervousness. "Well, if it isn't Jacob Miller," Martha said, her voice taking on the honey-sweet tone she used when she wanted to impress someone. "We so rarely see you in town these days. What brings you down from that lonely ranch of yours?" Rebecca finally turned, curious about this man who could silence a room with his presence. He stood in the doorway like a figure from one of her father's stories about the old country, tall and solid, with work-worn hands and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. His clothes were simple but well-made, the practical outfit of a man who worked with his hands and wasn't trying to impress anyone. "Supplies," he said simply, his gaze moving around the room before settling on Rebecca. Something in his expression shifted when he saw her, a flash of recognition or understanding that made her pulse quicken. "I believe you were helping this young lady when I came in?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Patterson's face turned red as he glanced nervously between Jacob and Martha's group, clearly caught between his desire to please his wealthier customers and his fear of this intimidating stranger. "Well, I was explaining that we're out of black thread," Patterson stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Perhaps she could come back another time when we have more stock." Jacob's eyes moved to the shelf behind the counter, where the black thread sat in plain view. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Rebecca caught the subtle change in his expression. For the first time since entering the store, she felt a spark of hope. "Funny thing about that thread sitting right there on the shelf?" Jacob said, his voice remaining calm but carrying an edge that made Patterson step backward. "Looks like black thread to me." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Rebecca watched in amazement as this stranger called out the lie that everyone in the store had been pretending to believe. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized someone was finally standing up for her. Martha's group exchanged worried glances, clearly sensing that their morning entertainment was about to take an unexpected turn. The power balance in the room had shifted dramatically with Jacob's arrival, and Rebecca could see the uncertainty in their faces as they tried to figure out how to respond. "Now see here," Martha began, her voice sharp with indignation. "We were here first, and we don't appreciate some outsider coming in and telling us how to run our business." "Your business?" Jacob turned slowly to face her, his presence somehow filling the entire store, despite his calm demeanor. "Last I checked, this was a public establishment, not a private club for judging your neighbors." Rebecca felt something warm and unfamiliar spreading through her chest. No one had ever defended her like this before, especially not a stranger who had nothing to gain from helping her. She watched as Jacob placed a silver dollar on the counter, the coin catching the light and gleaming like a small sun. "Mr. Patterson," Jacob said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "the lady would like to buy some black thread. After you've taken care of her, I'll purchase whatever supplies I need." The shopkeeper's hands trembled as he reached for the thread, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Rebecca watched in disbelief as the man who had denied her service just moments ago now practically fell over himself to help her. The spool of black thread felt precious in her hands, not because of its monetary value, but because someone had fought for her right to have it. "Here you are, miss," Patterson said, his voice shaking. "That'll be no charge. Consider it a welcome gift to our community." As Rebecca accepted the thread, her fingers briefly brushed against Jacob's where they rested on the counter. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her entire body, a sensation she had never experienced before. It wasn't fear or nervousness, but something warmer and more complicated that she couldn't quite name. Martha's eyes narrowed as she witnessed the small exchange between them. Rebecca could see the older woman's mind working, calculating this new development and its potential threat to the social order she had worked so hard to maintain. "This isn't over, Jacob Miller," Martha said, her voice low and dangerous. "This town has standards, and we won't let them be corrupted by outside influence." Jacob tipped his hat to her with exaggerated politeness, his gesture somehow managing to be both respectful and mocking at the same time. "Then I suggest you start by setting a better example, Mrs. Henderson." The autumn wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the promise of harder times ahead. Rebecca stood at her family's kitchen window, watching the gray clouds gather on the horizon as she kneaded bread dough with steady, practiced movements. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the general store, but the memory of Jacob Miller's kindness still warmed her heart during the coldest moments. Her father Samuel sat at the wooden table behind her, reading from their worn family Bible by the light of a kerosene lamp. His weathered hands turned the pages with the careful reverence of a man who had found comfort in those words through decades of hardship and uncertainty. The familiar sound of his quiet breathing and the rhythm of her own kneading created a peaceful atmosphere that Rebecca had learned to treasure. "The Lord is my shepherd," Samuel read aloud, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided their family through their difficult move to Wyoming territory. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." Rebecca smiled as she shaped the dough into loaves, remembering how her mother used to recite the same psalm while baking bread back in Pennsylvania. Some traditions carried forward no matter how far a family traveled, creating invisible threads that connected past and present in ways that gave meaning to the simplest daily tasks. The sound of running footsteps on the porch interrupted their peaceful evening routine. David, Rebecca's younger brother, burst through the door with his face flushed from excitement and exertion. His 17-year-old frame seemed to vibrate with nervous energy as he struggled to catch his breath. "Father," he gasped, his voice cracking with the stress of whatever news he carried. "You need to come outside. Now. There's something wrong with the barn." Rebecca's hands stilled on the dough as she saw the fear in her brother's eyes. Samuel closed the Bible carefully and rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and calm despite the obvious urgency of David's message. Years of farming had taught him that panic solved nothing, but swift action often prevented disaster. "What kind of wrong?" Samuel asked, reaching for his coat and hat from the peg by the door. "Is it the animals? The roof?" "Fire," David whispered, the word hanging in the air like a death sentence. "The whole barn is burning." Rebecca's heart stopped. She abandoned her bread dough and rushed to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass to see the orange glow that now painted the darkness beyond their small farmhouse. Flames danced against the night sky like demons, consuming everything her family had worked so hard to build. "Dear God," Samuel breathed, his usual composure finally cracking. "The winter feed. The animals." They ran outside together, their feet pounding across the hard-packed earth as they raced toward the inferno that had once been their barn. The heat hit Rebecca's face like a physical blow, and she had to shield her eyes from the brilliant orange light that turned night into a hellish version of day. Other members of their small Amish community had already arrived, their dark figures silhouetted against the flames as they worked frantically to save what they could. Men carried buckets of water in an endless chain, their efforts seeming pitifully small against the massive fire that consumed everything in its path. "The horses!" Rebecca cried, scanning the crowd for any sign of their animals. "Where are the horses?" "Safe," called out Eli Byler, their neighbor and one of the community elders. "We got them out in time, praise God, the cattle too. But the feed." He shook his head grimly, his meaning clear without words. Rebecca felt her knees go weak as she realized the full scope of their disaster. The barn had held all their winter hay, the grain that would have fed their animals through the harsh months ahead. Without it, they would have to buy feed at prices they couldn't afford, or worse, sell their livestock before winter set in. "How did it start?" Samuel asked, his voice barely audible above the roar of the flames. "Was it lightning? A lantern left burning?" Eli's face darkened as he moved closer to speak privately. "There was no lightning tonight, Samuel, and you know none of us would be careless with fire. This was set deliberately." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Someone had burned their barn on purpose, destroyed their livelihood out of pure malice. She thought of Martha Henderson's parting words at the general store, her promise that the confrontation wasn't over. Who would do such a thing? David asked, his young voice filled with the kind of bewilderment that came from discovering that evil existed in the world. We've done nothing to hurt anyone. Being different is enough for some people, Samuel said quietly, his eyes reflecting the dying flames. Fear makes people do terrible things, son. Fear of what they don't understand. Rebecca watched the last of their barn collapse in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The sound echoed across the plains like thunder, carrying with it the destruction of months of hard work and preparation. She thought of her mother's prayer beads in her pocket, wondering if faith alone would be enough to carry them through this trial. We should pack up and leave, David said, his voice breaking with emotion. Go back east, where people understand us. This place, these people, they don't want us here. Running away solves nothing, Samuel replied, but Rebecca could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. We came here seeking a new life, a place where we could worship and work in peace. We will not be driven out by those who choose hatred over understanding. As the fire finally began to die down, leaving only glowing embers and the skeletal remains of their barn, Rebecca found herself thinking about Jacob Miller. She wondered if he knew what had happened, if he would care that the family he had defended was now facing ruin. The thought of his strong, steady presence brought her a small measure of comfort in the darkness. The sound of approaching horses made everyone turn. Rebecca's heart raced as she wondered if their attackers had returned to finish their work or gloat over their success. Instead, she saw a familiar figure dismounting from his horse, his face grim with purpose and concern. Jacob Miller strode toward them through the smoke and ash, his boots crunching on the debris scattered around the burned barn. His eyes took in the destruction with the quick assessment of a man who understood both farming and the cruelty that some people were capable of inflicting on others. I saw the fire from my ranch, he said, addressing Samuel directly. I came as soon as I could. I'm sorry for your loss. Samuel nodded, studying this English stranger who had come to their aid. Rebecca could see her father weighing Jacob's words and actions, trying to understand what motivated this man to involve himself in their troubles. Thank you for coming, Samuel said simply. We will rebuild, God willing. Our faith teaches us that all things happen for a reason, even when we cannot see that reason clearly. With respect, sir, Jacob said, his voice carrying a hard edge that Rebecca had never heard before. This wasn't God's work. This was deliberate, and whoever did it isn't finished. They want you gone, and they'll keep escalating until they succeed or someone stops them. The blunt words sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the night air. She had hoped that their persecution would end with small slights and social rejection. But Jacob's assessment suggested something far more dangerous was coming. We do not fight, Samuel said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of generations of peaceful tradition. Violence only breeds more violence. We will endure what we must and trust in God's protection. I'm not asking you to fight, Jacob replied, his eyes moving to Rebecca before returning to her father. I'm asking you to let me help. You need allies in this territory, people who understand how your enemies think and operate. Rebecca felt her heart skip as she realized Jacob was offering to stand with them against whatever came next. The gesture was both thrilling and terrifying, representing a level of protection she had never dared hope for. And what do you gain from this alliance? Samuel asked, his tone carefully neutral. You barely know us, and helping us could bring trouble to your own doorstep. The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Rebecca held her breath, waiting for Jacob's answer, and somehow knowing that it would change everything for all of them. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the embers. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but filled with conviction. Maybe I'm tired of watching good people suffer while cowards hide behind their fear and hatred. Maybe I believe that everyone deserves a chance to live in peace, regardless of how they choose to worship or dress. He paused, and Rebecca felt the weight of his gaze as it found hers across the smoky darkness. Or maybe I found something in this community that's worth protecting. The words sent warmth racing through Rebecca's entire body, a feeling that had nothing to do with the heat from the dying fire. She saw understanding dawn in her father's eyes as he witnessed the exchange between them, his expression shifting from wariness to something that might have been approval. Very well, Samuel said finally. We welcome your help, Mr. Miller, but I want you to understand that we will not compromise our beliefs or our way of life, no matter what threats we face. I wouldn't ask you to, Jacob replied, Your strength comes from staying true to who you are, not from becoming like those who hate you. As the community began the long process of cleaning up and planning their next steps, Rebecca found herself working alongside Jacob to gather salvageable items from the ruins. Their shoulders brushed occasionally as they moved through the debris, and each contact sent small jolts of awareness through her body. "This won't end here," Jacob said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "They'll try something else, probably soon. You need to be careful, Rebecca. Don't go into town alone, and stay close to your family." The use of her first name sent a flutter through her stomach, but his warning sobered her quickly. "Do you really think they'll try to hurt us again?" "I think they'll do whatever it takes to drive you out," Jacob replied, his jaw tightening. "But they'll have to go through me first." The morning sun painted Jacob Miller's ranch house in shades of gold and amber as he hammered fresh boards into place, but his mind wasn't on the repairs that needed finishing before winter arrived. Every few minutes, he found himself glancing toward the distant smoke that still rose from the Yoder farm, wondering if Rebecca was safe, and whether her family had managed to salvage anything from the terrible fire that had destroyed their barn. His hands moved with practiced skill across the wood, but his thoughts kept drifting to the way Rebecca had looked at him the night before, her eyes reflecting something deeper than gratitude in the flickering light of the dying flames. He had lived alone on this ranch for 3 years, content with the company of cattle and horses, but something had changed the moment he saw her being mistreated in Patterson's store. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up from his work, squinting against the morning glare to see a rider approaching at full gallop. As the figure drew closer, Jacob recognized Tom Bradley, a neighboring rancher whose spread bordered his own property on the eastern side. Tom's face was flushed with excitement and something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Jacob!" Tom called out as he reined in his horse, the animal's sides heaving from the hard ride. "Thank God you're here. I've been riding since dawn trying to find you." Jacob set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his work pants, studying Tom's expression with growing concern. The two men had known each other for years, sharing the quiet friendship that developed between neighbors who respected each other's need for space and privacy. Tom wasn't the type to ride hard unless something serious was happening. "What's got you so worked up?" Jacob asked, stepping down from the porch to meet his friend. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse than a ghost," Tom replied, dismounting and tying his horse to the hitching post with shaking hands. "I've seen what happens when decent folks get pushed too far. There's trouble brewing in town, Jacob. Bad trouble." Jacob felt his stomach tighten as he remembered Martha Henderson's parting words at the general store. He had hoped that defending Rebecca would be enough to make the townspeople back down, but Tom's expression suggested that the situation was escalating beyond anything he had anticipated. "What kind of trouble?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind that ends with good people getting hurt," Tom said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Martha Henderson's been talking to anyone who listen, stirring up fear about the Amish folks. She's got some people convinced that they're dangerous, that they're trying to take over the town and force their beliefs on everyone else." Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had encountered prejudice before, but there was something particularly cruel about twisting people's peaceful nature into a reason to fear them. The Amish he had met were gentle souls who wanted nothing more than to live quietly and worship according to their conscience. "That's ridiculous," Jacob said, though he knew that fear didn't always respond to logic. "Anyone who's spent 5 minutes around those people knows they're not dangerous. They won't even raise their voices in an argument, let alone threaten anyone." "You know that, and I know that," Tom replied, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might be listening. "But fear doesn't care about facts, Jacob. Martha's got folks convinced that the Amish are judging them, looking down on them for drinking and dancing and living normal lives. She's making it sound like they're some kind of threat to the whole community." Jacob began pacing back and forth across his yard, his boots wearing a path in the packed earth as he tried to process what Tom was telling him. He thought of Rebecca's gentle smile, of her father's quiet dignity, of the way their entire community had worked together to save their animals from the fire. How could anyone see these people as a threat? "There's more," Tom continued, his voice barely audible now. "Word is that some of the men are planning to do something about it. They're meeting tonight at the saloon, and Martha's husband has been talking about organizing a group to encourage the Amish to leave town." The euphemism sent ice through Jacob's veins. He had lived in enough frontier towns to know what encouraging someone to leave usually involved: violence, intimidation, and the kind of mob mentality that turned ordinary people into monsters when they thought they could act without consequences. "How many men are we talking about?" Jacob asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Too many," Tom replied grimly. "Maybe a dozen, maybe more. Word spreading fast, and you know how these things go. Men who wouldn't normally hurt a fly start feeling brave when they're part of a group." Jacob stopped pacing and turned to face his friend directly. "Are you telling me this as a warning, or are you asking me to help stop it?" Tom's face flushed red, and he looked away toward the distant mountains. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's coming. What you do with that information is your choice, but I won't be part of it either way." The answer disappointed Jacob, but didn't surprise him. Tom was a good man, but like many good men, he preferred to avoid conflict rather than take a stand against injustice. Jacob couldn't blame him for choosing safety over principle, but he couldn't make the same choice himself. "I need to warn them," Jacob said, already planning his route to the Yoder farm. "They need to know what's coming so they can prepare or get somewhere safe." "Jacob," Tom said, his voice heavy with concern, "you can't save everyone. These people aren't your responsibility, and getting involved will only make you a target too. Is it really worth risking everything you've built here?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Jacob looked around at his ranch, at the buildings he had constructed with his own hands, at the land he had claimed and worked for 3 years. It represented security, independence, and the life he had always dreamed of building for himself. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Rebecca's face in the firelight, heard her soft voice thanking him for standing up for her, felt the brief touch of her fingers against his when she had accepted the thread from Patterson's store. Some things, he realized, were worth more than security. "Yes," Jacob said simply, "it's worth it." Tom shook his head sadly but didn't argue further. He mounted his horse and prepared to leave, but paused to look back at Jacob one more time. "Be careful, friend. Once you cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were." Jacob watched his friend ride away, understanding that their relationship had probably changed forever. Tom would always wonder if Jacob had chosen the right path, and Jacob would always wonder if Tom had chosen the coward's way out. But there was no time for regrets now. He saddled his horse quickly and set out for the Yoder farm, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. The morning air was crisp and clear, but Jacob could almost smell the storm that was approaching. By tonight, everything would be different. The Yoder farmhouse looked peaceful in the morning light, but Jacob could see the blackened remains of the barn in the distance, a stark reminder of how quickly violence could destroy what took years to build. He found Samuel and several other Amish men working to clear debris from the fire, their movements efficient and purposeful despite their obvious grief. "Mr. Yoder," Jacob called out as he approached, dismounting and tying his horse to a fence post. "I need to speak with you. All of you. It's urgent." Samuel looked up from the pile of twisted metal he was sorting, his weathered face showing concern at Jacob's serious tone. The other men gathered around, their simple work clothes and bearded faces giving them the appearance of biblical patriarchs facing an uncertain future. "What is it?" Samuel asked, setting down the piece of metal he had been examining. "Has something else happened?" Jacob took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would shatter the fragile peace these people had been trying to rebuild. "There's going to be trouble tonight. Martha Henderson has been stirring up fear in town, and some of the men are planning to come here. They want to force you to leave." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Several of the younger men stepped forward, their faces showing a mixture of fear and anger that Jacob had never seen in their peaceful community before. Even Samuel's calm composure cracked slightly as he processed the implications of what Jacob was telling them. "How many men?" asked Eli Byler, the community elder who had helped save the animals from the fire. "And what exactly are they planning to do?" "I don't know the details," Jacob admitted, "but I know it won't be a friendly conversation. They're meeting at the saloon tonight to organize, and they'll probably come here afterward when they're full of whiskey and courage." Rebecca appeared in the doorway of the farmhouse, her face pale as she overheard the conversation. Jacob's heart clenched as he saw the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the doorframe for support. This was exactly what he had hoped to prevent. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Father, What do we do? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from his daughter to Jacob and back again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions and uncertain futures. We could leave, he said slowly. Pack what we can and go somewhere else. Start over in a place where people might be more accepting. No, Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength. We've done nothing wrong. Why should we run from our own home? Jacob felt a surge of admiration for her courage, but he also understood the impossible position her family was in. They were peaceful people facing a violent threat, believers in non-resistance, confronting those who respected only force. There might be another way, Jacob said, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. What if you weren't alone when they came? What if they found more than just a few peaceful families? Samuel's eyes sharpened as he understood what Jacob was suggesting. You would stand with us? Against your own people? They're not my people, Jacob said firmly. My people are those who believe in justice and decency, regardless of what they wear or how they worship. And right now, that means standing with you. The words seemed to hang in the air like a promise and a challenge. Rebecca's eyes met his across the yard, and Jacob saw something there that made his pulse quicken. Hope, perhaps, or maybe something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. One man against a dozen won't make much difference, Eli said practically. We appreciate your courage, but we can't ask you to sacrifice yourself for our sake. You're not asking, Jacob replied. I'm offering. And besides, who says I have to be alone? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main street of Cheyenne as Jacob Miller walked purposefully toward the sheriff's office, his boots echoing on the wooden boardwalk with the steady rhythm of a man who had made up his mind about something important. Behind him, the town buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that always preceded trouble, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Coleman looked up from his desk when Jacob entered, his weathered face showing neither surprise nor welcome at the sight of his visitor. The two men had known each other for years, sharing the wary respect that developed between those who understood that law and justice weren't always the same thing in frontier towns. Jacob, Coleman said, not rising from his chair, I figured you'd be coming by today. Word travels fast in a town this size. Then you know why I'm here, Jacob replied, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk. The question is, what do you plan to do about it? Coleman leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk's surface. At 53, he had seen enough violence to know that preventing it was always better than cleaning up after it, but he also understood the political realities of keeping the peace in a town where the wealthy and influential expected their wishes to be respected. Look, Jacob, Coleman said finally, his voice carrying the weariness of a man caught between competing loyalties. I know these Amish folks are peaceful people. I've got no quarrel with them, and I'd prefer to see this whole situation just fade away quietly. But, Jacob prompted, hearing the unspoken word in the sheriff's tone. But Martha Henderson's got half the town convinced that these people are some kind of threat, Coleman continued. She's got folks believing that the Amish are judging them, trying to force their way of life on everyone else. Fear makes people do stupid things, and stupid people with guns make my job a lot harder. Jacob studied the sheriff's face, trying to read the man's true intentions. Coleman had always been fair in his dealings, but he was also a politician who understood that his job depended on keeping the town's most influential citizens happy. The Amish had no political power, no money to throw around, and no friends in high places. So you're going to let them run those families out of town? Jacob asked, his voice carrying a hard edge. Good people who've done nothing wrong, except dress differently and worship according to their conscience? I'm going to do my job, Coleman replied, but his tone suggested that even he wasn't entirely sure what that meant in this situation. I'll keep the peace as best I can, but I can't arrest people for having opinions or gathering to discuss their concerns. Even when those concerns involve violence? Jacob pressed. Even when they're planning to terrorize innocent families? Coleman's face flushed slightly, and he looked away toward the window that faced the main street. I haven't heard anything about specific plans for violence. People talk big when they're angry, but that doesn't mean they'll actually do anything. Jacob leaned forward in his chair, his eyes boring into the sheriff's. You know as well as I do that mobs don't stop with talk. Once they get worked up enough, once they've had enough whiskey to make them brave, They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want. And what exactly do you want me to do? Coleman asked, his voice rising slightly. Arrest half the town for having a meeting? Lock up Martha Henderson for expressing her opinions? I've got to follow the law, Jacob, not what I think might happen. The frustration in the sheriff's voice was genuine, but Jacob could also hear the fear underneath it. Coleman was a good man trying to do an impossible job, caught between his duty to protect all citizens and his need to maintain order in a town that was rapidly dividing along lines of prejudice and fear. I want you to be there, Jacob said simply. When they come for the Amish families, I want you to be there to remind them that the law applies to everyone, not just the people who look and think like them. Coleman was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying Jacob's face with the careful attention of a man trying to read another's true intentions. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're planning to be there too, aren't you? He asked. You're going to stand with them against whatever comes. Yes, Jacob said without hesitation. I am. That's a good way to get yourself killed, Coleman observed. These people you're defending, they won't even fight back. They'll just stand there and let whatever happens happen. Is that really worth dying for? Jacob thought of Rebecca's gentle smile, of her father's quiet dignity, of the way their entire community had worked together to save their animals from the fire. He thought of the courage it took to maintain your beliefs when the whole world seemed to be against you, and the strength required to respond to hatred with love. Yes, he said again. It is. Coleman sighed heavily and stood up from his desk, moving to the window to look out at the town he had sworn to protect. The afternoon light caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than his years and highlighting the weight of responsibility he carried on his shoulders. I'll be there, he said finally. I can't promise I'll be able to stop anything, but I'll be there to make sure the law is followed as much as possible. Jacob felt a surge of relief at the sheriff's words, but he also knew that one lawman wouldn't be enough to stop a determined mob. He needed more allies, more voices of reason that could help tip the balance away from violence and toward justice. Thank you, Jacob said, standing to leave. That means more than you know. Just be careful, Jacob, Coleman called out as he reached the door. Once you take a stand like this, there's no going back. You'll have enemies in this town for the rest of your life. Jacob paused in the doorway, considering the sheriff's warning. He thought of his peaceful ranch, of the quiet life he had built for himself, of all the things he might lose by involving himself in this conflict. Then he thought of Rebecca's eyes in the firelight, and knew that some things were worth any price. I can live with that, he said, and stepped out into the afternoon sun. The saloon was already crowded when Jacob arrived, despite the early hour. Men who should have been working their farms or tending their businesses stood around in small groups, their voices low and urgent as they discussed the situation that had brought them together. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of whiskey, creating an atmosphere that seemed to encourage reckless bravery. Jacob spotted several men he recognized from around town, faces that belonged to neighbors and acquaintances, who had always seemed reasonable and fair-minded, but tonight, influenced by fear and alcohol, they looked like strangers capable of terrible things. Well, look who decided to join us, called out Pete Morrison, the blacksmith's apprentice who had taunted Rebecca on the street. I didn't expect to see you here, Miller. Thought you might be too busy protecting your new friends. The comment drew chuckles from several men, but Jacob could see the nervousness underneath their bravado. They knew he was there for a reason, and they weren't entirely sure what that reason might be. I'm here to talk sense, Jacob said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded room. Before anyone does something they'll regret. The only thing we'll regret, said Bill Henderson, Martha's husband, is letting these people establish a foothold in our town. They think they're better than us, with their plain clothes and their holier-than-thou attitudes. Have any of you actually talked to these people? Jacob asked, looking around the room at faces that showed varying degrees of hostility and uncertainty. Do you know anything about what they actually believe? Or are you just afraid of what you don't understand? We know enough, Henderson replied, his voice slurred slightly from the whiskey he had been drinking. We know they judge us for living normal lives, for enjoying a drink or a dance. We know they want to change this town into something that suits their narrow view of how people should live. Jacob felt his patience wearing thin as he listened to the lies and misconceptions that had been repeated so often they had taken on the weight of truth. That's not what they want, he said firmly. They want to be left alone to live according to their beliefs, just like you want to be left alone to live according to yours. Then why don't they dress like normal people? Demanded another voice from the crowd. Why do they have to make a show of being different? Because their faith teaches them that simple living and modest dress are ways of honoring God, Jacob replied. Just like your faith might teach you other things that seem strange to outsiders. The argument continued for another hour, with Jacob finding himself increasingly outnumbered as more men arrived and the level of alcohol consumption rose. He could see that reason was losing ground to fear and prejudice, and that the situation was rapidly approaching a point where violence would become inevitable. Finally, Henderson stood up and called for attention. Enough talking, he announced. We all know why we're here. These people need to understand that they're not welcome in our town, and talking isn't going to convince them to leave. A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd, and Jacob felt his heart sink as he realized that his efforts to prevent violence had failed. These men had already made up their minds, and nothing he could say would change their course. What exactly are you planning to do? Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We're going to pay them a visit, Henderson said with a cold smile. We're going to explain the situation to them in terms they'll understand. And if they don't listen, well, accidents happen on frontier farms all the time. The threat was clear, and Jacob felt anger rising in his chest like a tide. These men were talking about terrorizing innocent families, about using fear and violence to drive out people whose only crime was being different. I won't let you do this, Jacob said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. I'll stand with them, and I'll fight anyone who tries to hurt them. The room fell silent as men processed what Jacob had just said. They had expected him to voice objections, perhaps to try to talk them out of their plans, but they hadn't expected him to throw down such a direct challenge. You're 1 man against 20, Henderson said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. Are you really willing to die for these people? Jacob looked around the room at faces that had once been friendly, at neighbors who had become enemies, at the price of standing up for what was right in a world that often rewarded cowardice and cruelty. If that's what it takes, he said simply. Yes. The thunder of 20 horses pounding across the Wyoming plains shattered the peaceful evening quiet as Martha Henderson led her angry mob toward the Yoder farm, their torches flickering like angry eyes in the growing darkness. Behind her rode men she had turned from neighbors into enemies, their faces twisted with the kind of hatred that grows when fear meets whiskey and finds a target to blame for all of life's disappointments. Rebecca stood at her family's kitchen window, watching the orange dots of light grow larger in the distance, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had known this moment would come, but seeing it approach still filled her with terror that made her legs feel weak and her hands shake uncontrollably. The peaceful life her family had tried to build in Wyoming territory was about to be destroyed by people who couldn't stand the sight of anyone different from themselves. Father, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own rapid breathing. They're coming, just like Jacob said they would. Samuel Yoder looked up from his Bible, his weathered face showing the strain of a man who had spent the day preparing for violence while praying it wouldn't come. Around him, the other men of their small Amish community sat in silent prayer, their simple clothes and bearded faces giving them the appearance of biblical patriarchs facing an impossible test of faith. How many? Samuel asked, his voice steady despite the fear that flickered in his eyes. Too many, Rebecca replied, pressing her face against the cold glass to get a better view of the approaching riders. Maybe 20 men, all carrying torches and weapons. They're riding fast, like they're eager to get here and finish what they started with the barn. The room fell silent, except for the sound of nervous breathing and the distant thunder of hoofbeats drawing closer with each passing second. Rebecca thought of her mother's prayer beads in her pocket, wondering if faith would be enough to protect them from the violence that was racing toward their farm like a wildfire across dry grass. Where is Jacob? Asked Eli Byler, the community elder whose calm voice had guided them through countless difficulties. He promised he would be here when they came. He'll come, Rebecca said with more confidence than she felt. He gave his word, and he's not the kind of man who breaks promises. But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her mind like poison. Jacob was just 1 man against 20, and she knew that even his courage had limits. What if he had decided that helping them wasn't worth dying for? What if he had realized that standing with her family would only make him a target without changing the outcome? The sound of a single horse, approaching from the opposite direction, made everyone turn toward the front door. Rebecca's heart leaped as she recognized the familiar silhouette of Jacob Miller dismounting from his horse. His movements quick and purposeful despite the overwhelming odds he faced. "Thank God," she breathed, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. He came. Jacob burst through the door without knocking, his face grim with determination and something else that Rebecca couldn't quite identify. His clothes were dusty from hard riding, and she could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes as he looked around the room at the peaceful people who were depending on him for protection. "They're about 5 minutes behind me," he said without preamble. 20 men, all armed, all drunk enough to be dangerous. Henderson's leading them, and Martha's been filling their heads with lies about what you people represent. "What do we do?" David asked, his young voice cracking with fear. "Father says we can't fight them, but we can't just let them destroy everything we've built here." Jacob's eyes moved to Rebecca, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken despite the danger they faced. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "But it's going to require trust, and it's going to require courage from all of you." "What kind of courage?" Samuel asked, his tone wary but interested. "The courage to stand up for yourselves without violence," Jacob replied. "The courage to face down a mob with nothing but faith and the truth on your side." Before anyone could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats reached the farmhouse, and orange torchlight began to flicker through the windows. Rebecca felt her stomach clench as she heard the sound of men shouting, their voices rough with alcohol and hatred. "This is it," Jacob said quietly. "Whatever happens, remember that they're afraid of you because you represent something they don't understand. Don't let their fear make you afraid of who you are." The front door burst open without warning, and Martha Henderson strode into the room like an avenging angel, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. Behind her came her husband Bill and a dozen other men, their faces flushed with drink and the kind of excitement that comes from being part of something larger than themselves. "Well, well," Martha said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Look what we have here. The whole nest of troublemakers, all gathered together in one place. You're not welcome here," Samuel said, rising from his chair with the quiet dignity that had always marked his character. "This is private property, and you have no right to enter our home." "We have every right," Bill Henderson snarled, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "This is our town, and we decide who belongs here and who doesn't." Jacob stepped forward, positioning himself between the intruders and the Amish families. "Actually, you don't," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made even angry men think twice. "Last I checked, this was still America, where people have the right to live according to their beliefs. Not when those beliefs threaten the moral foundation of our community," Martha shot back. "These people think they're better than us, with their plain clothes and their holier-than-thou attitudes. They're a cancer that needs to be cut out before it spreads." "The only cancer here is the hatred you're spreading," Jacob replied, his voice remaining calm despite the tension crackling through the room. "These people have done nothing but try to live in peace, and you've turned that into a crime." The confrontation might have escalated into violence at that moment, but a new voice suddenly cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough!" Sheriff Coleman appeared in the doorway, his badge glinting in the torchlight, and his hand resting on his weapon. Behind him came 3 deputies, their presence immediately changing the dynamic in the room, as the mob realized they were no longer facing defenseless victims. "Sheriff," Martha said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone, "thank goodness you're here. We were just explaining to these people that they need to find somewhere else to live." "By breaking into their home with weapons?" Coleman asked, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "By threatening peaceful citizens who haven't broken any laws?" "We're not threatening anyone," Bill Henderson protested, but his hand moved away from his pistol. "We're just trying to protect our community from outside influence." "By terrorizing families? By burning barns?" Coleman's voice hardened. "I know what happened here last week, Henderson. I know who was responsible for that fire, and I know what you're planning to do tonight." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Rebecca saw several of the men exchange nervous glances. They had come expecting to face defenseless victims, not a sheriff who knew about their earlier crimes. "You can't prove anything," Henderson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And even if you could, these people don't belong here. They're disrupting the natural order of things. The natural order? Jacob's voice carried a note of disbelief. You mean the order where people like you decide who gets to live in peace and who doesn't? I mean the order where normal people don't have to feel judged by self-righteous fanatics, Martha spat. Where children can grow up without being exposed to strange ideas about how they should live. What's strange about treating people with kindness? Rebecca asked, her voice cutting through the tension with surprising strength. What's strange about working hard and helping your neighbors? The question seemed to catch Martha off guard, and for a moment, she struggled to find a response. Rebecca pressed her advantage, stepping forward despite the danger. You say we judge you, but we've never said a word against how you choose to live, she continued. You say we're trying to change your town, but all we've done is try to build a life for ourselves. The only judgment here is coming from you. Don't you dare lecture me, Martha snarled, her composure finally cracking. You and your kind think you're so pure, so perfect, but you're just people, flawed and sinful like the rest of us. Yes, Rebecca said simply. We are just people, flawed and sinful, trying to do our best with the life God gave us, just like you. The simple admission seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. Several of the men who had come with the mob looked uncomfortable, as if they were seeing the situation from a different perspective for the first time. This is getting us nowhere, Coleman said, his voice cutting through the moment of uncertainty. Henderson, you and your men need to leave. Now, before someone gets hurt and I have to start making arrests. You can't protect them forever, Martha said, her voice low and dangerous. This community won't stand for having these people among us. One way or another, they'll have to go. Maybe, Jacob said quietly. But it won't be tonight. And it won't be because of threats and violence. The standoff continued for another tense moment, with both sides facing each other across the small room like armies preparing for battle. Then, slowly, the mob began to retreat, their torches flickering as they moved back toward the door. This isn't over, Henderson said as he reached the threshold. We'll be watching, and we'll be waiting. One mistake, one step out of line, and we'll be back. We'll be ready, Jacob replied, his voice carrying a promise that made the other man's eyes narrow with anger. The morning sun painted the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson as Rebecca walked slowly through her family's vegetable garden, her fingers trailing across the tomato plants that had somehow survived the first frost of the season. The events of the previous night felt like a dream, but the trampled earth around their farmhouse and the lingering smell of torch smoke in the air reminded her that the confrontation had been all too real. Her father, Samuel, worked nearby, repairing fence posts that had been damaged when the mob's horses had crowded too close to their property. His movements were steady and methodical, but Rebecca could see the weight of worry in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward the road, as if expecting trouble to return at any moment. The community is talking about leaving, Samuel said without looking up from his work. Elder Byler thinks we should pack up and try to find a more welcoming place. Somewhere, people might be more accepting of our ways. Rebecca felt her heart sink at the words. They had worked so hard to build a life here, to create something meaningful from the raw frontier land. The thought of abandoning everything they had accomplished felt like admitting defeat, like letting hatred win over hope. What do you think we should do? She asked, though she suspected she already knew her father's answer. I think we should pray for guidance, Samuel replied, his voice carrying the patience of a man who had faced difficult decisions before. And we should remember that sometimes the Lord calls us to stand firm, even when standing firm seems impossible. The sound of approaching horses made them both tense. But Rebecca's fear turned to relief when she recognized Jacob Miller's familiar silhouette riding toward them. He had spent the night at their farm, sleeping in the barn to make sure the mob didn't return, and she had found herself grateful for his presence in ways that went beyond simple protection. Morning, Jacob said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had slept little and worried much. I've been thinking about what Henderson said last night, about this not being over. And? Samuel asked, setting down his hammer to give Jacob his full attention. And I think he's right, Jacob replied grimly. They're not going to give up just because the sheriff showed up once. They'll wait, and they'll plan, and they'll try again when they think we're not ready. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. So what do we do? How do we protect ourselves against people who are determined to drive us out? We make allies. Jacob said, his voice taking on a note of determination. We show the people of this town that you're not the threat Martha Henderson claims you are. We make them see you as neighbors, not enemies. How? Samuel asked, his tone skeptical. These people have already made up their minds about us. They see our plain clothes and our simple ways, and they assume we're judging them. Then we change how they see you, Jacob replied. We show them your kindness, your generosity, your willingness to help others. We make it impossible for them to think of you as anything but good neighbors. Rebecca felt a spark of hope at Jacob's words, but she also understood the challenges they faced. It won't be easy, she said. People believe what they want to believe, and if they want to see us as a threat, they'll find reasons to justify that belief. Maybe, Jacob agreed, but not everyone in town is like Martha Henderson. There are decent people who are just scared because they don't understand what you represent. If we can reach those people, if we can show them the truth about your community, we might be able to change things. Before anyone could respond, the sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road drew their attention. A small convoy of vehicles was approaching, led by a man Rebecca didn't recognize but whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked him as someone important. Who do you suppose that is? Samuel asked, shading his eyes against the morning sun to get a better look at the approaching visitors. I don't know, Jacob replied, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. But they're not from around here. Those clothes and that fancy wagon suggest someone with money and influence. The convoy stopped in front of the farmhouse, and the lead man dismounted from his horse with the easy grace of someone accustomed to being in charge. He was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Mr. Yoder, the man said, approaching Samuel with his hand extended. My name is William Morrison. I'm a territorial representative from the government office in Cheyenne, and I've come to speak with you about recent events in your community. Samuel shook the offered hand warily, clearly uncertain about what this official visit might mean for his family. What can I do for you, Mr. Morrison? I understand there's been some trouble between your people and certain residents of the town, Morrison said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a politician. Burned buildings, threats, intimidation. The territorial government is concerned about maintaining order and protecting the rights of all citizens. We appreciate your concern, Samuel replied carefully, but we've done nothing wrong. We simply want to live in peace and practice our faith without interference. I'm sure you do, Morrison said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But the reality is that your presence here has created division in the community. People are choosing sides, and that kind of conflict can be dangerous for everyone involved. Rebecca felt her heart sink as she began to understand where this conversation was heading. This man hadn't come to help them. He had come to convince them to leave voluntarily, to solve the problem by removing what he saw as its cause. Are you asking us to leave? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. I'm suggesting that it might be in everyone's best interest if you considered relocating to a more suitable area, Morrison replied diplomatically. The government has land available in other parts of the territory, places where your community might find a more welcoming reception. And if we refuse? Jacob asked, his voice carrying a hard edge that made Morrison's smile falter slightly. Then you'll continue to face the kind of harassment you've already experienced, Morrison said, his diplomatic mask slipping to reveal the pragmatic politician underneath. The territorial government can't provide protection to every family that faces social pressure, Mr. Miller. We have limited resources and many responsibilities. So you're abandoning them to the mob, Jacob said flatly. You're telling them that they have no rights if the majority doesn't like them. I'm telling them that sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, Morrison replied. That sometimes it's better to avoid conflict than to insist on principles that might get people hurt. The conversation continued for another hour, with Morrison using every persuasive technique in his political arsenal to convince the Amish families to leave voluntarily. He spoke of better opportunities elsewhere, of the difficulties of frontier life, of the benefits of avoiding conflict with their neighbors. But Rebecca could see that her father wasn't convinced. Samuel's faith had been tested many times before, and he had learned to distinguish between genuine concern and political expediency. This man wanted them gone not because he cared about their welfare, but because their presence was creating problems he didn't want to deal with. "We appreciate your visit, Mr. Morrison," Samuel said finally. "But we've made our home here and we intend to stay. We're not troublemakers and we're not criminals. We're simply people trying to live according to our beliefs." Morrison's face showed disappointment but not surprise. "I hope you'll reconsider," he said as he prepared to leave. "The situation here is volatile, and I can't guarantee that the territorial government will be able to help you if things escalate further." "We understand," Samuel replied, "but some things are worth the risk." As the official convoy departed, Rebecca felt a mixture of pride and fear. Her father had chosen to stand firm despite the pressure, but she knew that their decision would have consequences. They were now truly on their own, with no help coming from the government and enemies gathering in the town. "That was brave," Jacob said quietly, moving to stand beside her as they watched the wagons disappear down the road. "But it was also dangerous. You've just told the territorial government that you won't be intimidated, and that means they'll stop trying to protect you." "We never had their protection to begin with," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "We've always been on our own out here, and we've always known that our faith was the only thing we could truly depend on." "Your faith," Jacob said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "And maybe a few good friends who believe in standing up for what's right." The words hung between them like a promise, and Rebecca felt her heart respond with its own silent declaration. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, she knew that Jacob would stand with them. And somehow, that knowledge made even the uncertain future seem less frightening. A gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder, sending birds exploding from the trees around the Yoder farm as Rebecca dropped her water bucket and ran toward the sound of her brother's terrified screams. David stood frozen beside their well, his face pale as winter snow, pointing toward a figure sprawled motionless in the tall grass near their property line. "Someone's been shot," David shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "I heard the gun go off, and then I saw him fall." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as she raced across the uneven ground, her long skirt catching on brambles and her breath coming in short gasps. Behind her, she could hear her father and the other men running to catch up, their heavy boots pounding against the earth like drums of war. The fallen figure was a stranger, a young man dressed in the rough clothes of a traveling merchant, his face twisted with pain as he clutched his bleeding shoulder. His horse stood nearby, its eyes rolling white with fear, still saddled and loaded with packages that suggested he had been on his way to town when disaster struck. "Help me," the stranger gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I don't want to die out here." Rebecca knelt beside him without hesitation, her hands moving to examine his wound despite the blood that stained his shirt. She had helped her father tend injured animals many times, and the basic principles seemed the same for humans. Stop the bleeding, ease the pain, and get proper help as quickly as possible. "David, bring clean cloth from the house," she ordered, her voice steady, despite the fear racing through her veins. "Father, we need to get him inside where we can treat this properly." "Wait," Samuel said, his weathered face showing the caution that came from years of surviving in dangerous territory. "We don't know who shot him, or why. They might still be out there, watching us." The thought sent ice through Rebecca's stomach. She glanced around at the rolling hills and scattered trees that surrounded their farm, realizing that a hidden gunman could be anywhere, possibly with his weapon trained on them at this very moment. But the wounded man needed help, and her conscience wouldn't let her abandon him to save herself. "I don't care," she said firmly, pressing her apron against his bleeding shoulder. "We can't just let him die, because we're afraid of who might be watching." Jacob appeared at her side as if from nowhere, his rifle in his hands and his eyes scanning the horizon for threats. "Any idea who did this?" he asked the wounded man, his voice gentle but urgent. "3 men," the stranger managed to gasp out between waves of pain. "Rode up fast, demanded my money and goods. When I tried to get away, one of them shot me. They took everything and rode toward town." "Robbers," Samuel said grimly. "Highway bandits who prey on travelers. They're becoming more common as word spreads about the gold discoveries up north." Jacob's face darkened with anger, and something else that Rebecca couldn't quite identify. "Did you recognize any of them? Could you describe their faces or their horses?" The wounded man closed his eyes, clearly struggling to stay conscious. One had a scar across his cheek. Another rode a bay mare with white stockings. The third looked like a town man, not a frontier rider. Well-dressed, clean-shaven. Rebecca felt her blood turn cold as she processed the description. The combination of a scarred face, a distinctive horse, and a well-dressed accomplice painted a picture that suggested these weren't random criminals passing through the territory. These were men who knew the area, who understood which travelers carried valuables and which routes they used. "We need to get him to Dr. Williams in town," she said, looking up at Jacob with eyes that pleaded for his help. "He's lost too much blood, and that bullet needs to come out properly." "Taking him to town might be exactly what they want," Jacob replied, his voice heavy with concern. "If this was planned, if they're trying to draw us into some kind of trap, we could be riding straight into danger." "Then what do you suggest?" Samuel asked, his own worry evident in the lines around his eyes. "Let him die here rather than risk our own safety?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, highlighting the impossible choice they faced. Helping the stranger was the right thing to do, but it might also be exactly what their enemies wanted, a reason to force them away from the safety of their farm and into a situation where they could be easily attacked. "I'll go alone," Rebecca said suddenly, her decision surprising everyone, including herself. One person on horseback can move fast and attract less attention than a group. "I can get him to the doctor and be back before anyone realizes we've left the farm." "Absolutely not," Jacob said immediately, his voice carrying the authority of someone who wouldn't accept argument. "You're not riding into town alone, not with bandits operating in the area and half the population already hostile toward your family." "Then come with me," Rebecca replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Help me save this man's life, and worry about the consequences later." The challenge in her voice seemed to settle something in Jacob's mind. He looked down at the wounded stranger, then back at Rebecca's determined face, and she could see him weighing the risks against the moral imperative of helping someone in need. "All right," he said finally, "but we go armed, we stay alert, and we don't take any unnecessary chances. If this is a trap, we're going to be ready for it." Within minutes, they had the wounded man loaded into the back of Jacob's wagon, cushioned with blankets and as comfortable as they could make him, given the circumstances. Rebecca climbed up beside Jacob on the driver's seat, her father's rifle across her lap, and her mother's prayer beads wrapped around her wrist like armor against the unknown dangers ahead. "Be careful," Samuel called out as they prepared to leave. "Trust no one completely, and remember that people aren't always who they appear to be." The journey to town took nearly an hour, with Jacob driving carefully to avoid jostling their injured passenger too severely. The wounded man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling about his attackers, and sometimes calling out for someone named Mary, who was apparently waiting for him in Denver. "You realize this could be exactly what they want," Jacob said quietly, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead for signs of ambush. "Draw us away from your farm, separate us from your family. Get us isolated where they can attack without interference." "I know," Rebecca replied, checking on their passenger for the dozenth time. "But what was the alternative? Let an innocent man die because we were afraid of what might happen? Some people would say that protecting your own family comes first," Jacob observed, though his tone suggested he wasn't necessarily one of those people. "My family taught me that all people are our family," Rebecca said simply. "That we're called to help others regardless of the cost to ourselves. Sometimes, faith requires risking everything for someone you've never met." Jacob was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words and the conviction behind them. "That's a dangerous way to live," he said finally. "Yes," Rebecca agreed, "but it's the only way I know how to live." They reached the outskirts of Cheyenne without incident, but Rebecca could feel the tension in Jacob's shoulders as they approached the main street. Too many people were watching them. Too many conversations stopped when they passed, and too many eyes followed their progress with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. "Something's wrong," Jacob muttered, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "The whole town feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen." Dr. Williams' office sat at the end of the main street, marked by a simple wooden sign that had weathered countless frontier storms. Rebecca had never met the man, but she had heard he was competent and fair, treating anyone who could pay his fees, regardless of their background or beliefs. They pulled up in front of the building just as the doctor himself emerged, apparently alerted by someone who had seen them coming. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and capable hands, the sort of person who had chosen medicine because he genuinely wanted to help others rather than simply make money. "What have we here?" Dr. Williams asked, moving immediately to examine their passenger. "Gunshot wound, by the look of it. How long ago did this happen?" "About 2 hours," Rebecca replied, climbing down from the wagon to help carry the wounded man inside. "He was robbed by 3 men on horseback. Lost a lot of blood but stayed conscious most of the way here." "Robbers, you say?" The doctor's face darkened as he processed this information. "That's the 3rd incident this month. Someone's been targeting travelers on the roads around here, and they're getting bolder." As they carried the stranger into the doctor's office, Rebecca caught sight of several familiar faces watching from across the street. Martha Henderson stood with her usual group of followers, their expressions suggesting they had been discussing something important before being interrupted by the arrival of the wagon. "Jacob," Rebecca whispered urgently, "look who's watching us." Jacob followed her gaze and cursed under his breath. "They know we're here," he said grimly. "Whatever they've been planning, our arrival just gave them the perfect opportunity to put it into motion." The doctor's office fell into tense silence as Rebecca held the wounded stranger's hand while Dr. Williams prepared his instruments. But through the window she could see Martha Henderson gathering more people in the street, their animated gestures suggesting they were planning something that wouldn't end well for anyone in the building. "Hold still now," Dr. Williams murmured to his patient, his skilled hands moving to clean the wound. "This is going to hurt, but I need to get that bullet out before infection sets in." Rebecca watched the doctor work, admiring his steady hands and gentle manner, but her attention kept drifting to the growing crowd outside. What had started as Martha's usual circle of followers was rapidly expanding to include men she didn't recognize, faces that carried the hard edges of people accustomed to violence. "Jacob," she whispered, nodding toward the window, "we might have a problem." Jacob moved to peer through the glass, his face growing grim as he took in the scene developing in the street. "More than a problem," he said quietly. "That's not just an angry crowd anymore. Those are the same men who came to your farm, plus some new faces I don't like the look of." The wounded stranger groaned as Dr. Williams probed for the bullet, his face pale and sweaty despite the cool temperature in the office. "How much longer?" Rebecca asked the doctor, her voice tight with worry. "Few more minutes," Williams replied, without looking up from his work. "But if there's trouble brewing outside, you might want to consider leaving before it gets worse." "We can't leave him," Rebecca said firmly. "Not when he's helpless and depending on us for protection." "Noble sentiment," the doctor observed, finally extracting the bullet with a satisfied grunt. "But nobility won't stop a lynch mob if they decide you're responsible for whatever's got them worked up." Through the window, Rebecca could see Martha Henderson pointing directly at the doctor's office, her voice carrying clearly across the street despite the distance. The crowd was growing larger and more agitated with each passing minute, fed by rumors and speculation that seemed to paint Rebecca and Jacob as the villains in whatever story Martha was telling. "What are they saying?" Rebecca asked, straining to hear the specific accusations being leveled against them. "From what I can make out," Jacob said grimly, "they're claiming we're involved with the robbery, that we brought the wounded man here as part of some scheme to divert attention from our real crimes." The accusation was so absurd that Rebecca almost laughed, but the angry faces outside made it clear that logic and truth weren't driving the crowd's emotions. Fear and prejudice had created a story that made them feel justified in their hatred, and facts wouldn't be allowed to interfere with that narrative. "That's insane," she protested. "Why would we rob someone and then bring them for medical help? What possible sense would that make?" "Angry mobs don't need to make sense," Dr. Williams observed, finishing his work on the bullet wound. "They just need someone to blame for their problems. And right now, you folks seem to be the most convenient target." A rock crashed through the window, sending glass shards across the floor and making everyone duck for cover. Outside, the crowd had surged closer to the building, their voices raised in a chant that sent chills down Rebecca's spine. "Come out and face justice," someone shouted. "We know what you've done and we won't let you hide behind the doctor's skirts." "Justice?" Jacob called back through the broken window. "What justice is there in blaming innocent people for crimes they didn't commit?" "Innocent?" Martha Henderson's voice cut through the din like a blade. "You call it innocent to harbor criminals? To protect robbers and murderers from the consequences of their actions? Rebecca felt her temper flare at the unjust accusations. These people had decided she was guilty before examining any evidence, convicting her based on nothing more than their own prejudices and Martha's poisonous words. "We're not harboring anyone," she called out, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. "We found this man shot and bleeding, and we brought him here for help. That's what decent people do when they find someone in need. Decent people don't consort with highway robbers," came a voice from the crowd. "Decent people don't protect criminals from honest citizens seeking justice. The only criminals here are the ones who shot an innocent man and stole his goods," Jacob replied, his voice hard with anger. "If you want justice, go find the real robbers instead of attacking the people who tried to help their victim." The argument might have continued indefinitely, but a new voice suddenly cut through the chaos with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun and his hand resting on his weapon. "What's all this about?" Coleman demanded, his eyes moving from the broken window to the angry faces surrounding the building. "Martha, what's got everyone so worked up?" "These people are protecting criminals," Martha replied, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when she wanted to sound rational. "They brought a wounded robber to town and are trying to help him escape justice." "Is that so?" Coleman looked up at the broken window where Jacob stood. "Miller, what's your side of this story?" "We found a man shot by robbers on the road near the Yoder farm," Jacob called down. "We brought him here for medical treatment because it was the right thing to do. Now this crowd wants to string us up for being good Samaritans." Coleman's weathered face showed the weariness of a man caught between competing versions of truth. "Anyone actually see these people commit a robbery?" he asked the crowd. "Any witnesses to actual crimes?" The question produced shuffling feet and downcast eyes, but no actual evidence. Martha's face flushed with anger as she realized her accusations weren't going to stand up to official scrutiny. "Sometimes you don't need to see a crime to know it's been committed," she said defensively. "Sometimes the evidence speaks for itself." "What evidence?" Coleman pressed. "A wounded man who claims he was robbed? People who brought him for help? That's not evidence of guilt, Martha. That's evidence of good Samaritan behavior." The sheriff's words seemed to take some of the wind out of the crowd's sails, but Rebecca could see that the anger hadn't dissipated entirely. These people wanted someone to blame for their fears and frustrations, and logical arguments weren't going to satisfy that need completely. "Why don't we ask the victim himself?" Coleman suggested. "If he was robbed, he can tell us who did it. If these people were involved, he'll be able to identify them." Dr. Williams appeared at the broken window, his medical bag in hand and his face showing professional concern. "The patient is stable now," he announced. "Weak from blood loss, but conscious and able to speak clearly." "Bring him out here," Coleman ordered. "Let's get this settled once and for all." A few minutes later, the wounded stranger appeared in the doorway, supported by Jacob and looking pale but alert. His eyes moved over the crowd with confusion and growing alarm as he realized he had become the center of some kind of controversy. "Sir," Coleman said formally, "these people claim you were robbed by highway bandits. Can you tell us what happened?" "3 men stopped me on the road," the stranger said, his voice weak but clear. "They demanded my money and goods. When I tried to ride away, one of them shot me. These folks," he gestured toward Rebecca and Jacob, "found me bleeding and brought me here for help. They probably saved my life." "And can you describe the men who robbed you?" Coleman continued. "One had a scar across his left cheek," the wounded man replied. "Another rode a bay mare with white stockings. The third was well-dressed, like a town man rather than a frontier rider." A murmur went through the crowd as people processed this description. Several faces showed recognition, and Rebecca saw more than one person glance nervously toward the edges of the group where men matching those descriptions might be standing. "Well-dressed, you say?" Coleman repeated, his eyes moving over the crowd with new interest. "Like someone from town rather than a drifter." The implications of the wounded man's testimony were clear to everyone present. The robbers weren't mysterious strangers passing through the territory. They were local men, possibly people standing in the very crowd that had gathered to demand justice. "That doesn't prove anything," Martha said quickly, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Descriptions can be wrong, especially from someone who's been shot and is probably confused." Confused about being robbed and shot? Jacob asked skeptically. I think he'd remember something like that pretty clearly. The point is, Coleman said firmly, there's no evidence that these people were involved in any crime. In fact, all the evidence suggests they acted as good citizens should when they found someone in need of help. The crowd began to disperse slowly, their earlier anger replaced by embarrassment and uncertainty. Some people slipped away quietly, apparently realizing they had been manipulated into supporting an unjust cause. Others lingered, still muttering about outsiders and the changes coming to their peaceful town. Martha Henderson stood at the center of the diminishing crowd, her face flushed with humiliation and rage. She had been publicly proven wrong, her accusations shown to be baseless, and her attempt to turn the town against Rebecca had backfired spectacularly. This isn't over, she said quietly, her words meant for Rebecca's ears alone. You may have won this round, but there will be others, and next time, you won't be so lucky. Rebecca met the older woman's gaze steadily, no longer intimidated by threats and bluster. There doesn't have to be a next time, she said gently. We could be neighbors instead of enemies, if you'd let us. Never, Martha spat. This town will never accept your kind, no matter how many people you save or how much good you pretend to do. With that, she turned and walked away, her remaining followers trailing behind like the remnants of a defeated army. Rebecca watched them go, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief that this particular confrontation was over. Well, Dr. Williams said, breaking the tension, that was more excitement than I usually see in a month. But the important thing is that my patient is going to recover, thanks to your quick thinking and courage. Anyone would have done the same thing, Rebecca said modestly. No, Jacob corrected her, his eyes soft with admiration. Not everyone would have risked their own safety to help a stranger. What you did today took real courage. As they prepared to return home, Rebecca realized that something fundamental had changed during their time in town. She had stood up to an angry mob, faced down false accusations, and emerged stronger than before. The frightened girl who had once cowered in Patterson's store was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it. The journey back to the farm was peaceful. The wounded stranger stable enough to sit up and take notice of the beautiful Wyoming landscape around them. But Rebecca's mind was already racing ahead to the challenges that still awaited them, and the knowledge that Martha Henderson's defeat would only make her more determined to find another way to drive the Amish families from their new home. Spring arrived in Wyoming territory, with a gentle warmth that seemed to wash away the bitter memories of the previous autumn's conflicts. And Rebecca Yoder stood in her flourishing garden, watching her tomato seedlings reach toward the morning sun, like tiny green prayers made visible. The year 1868 had brought changes she could never have imagined when her family first arrived in this hostile land, transformations that went far deeper than the seasonal cycles of planting and harvest. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the yard as young ones from both the Amish community and the town played together, their games creating bridges between worlds that adults had spent months trying to tear apart. Rebecca smiled as she watched little Sarah Patterson chase David's youngest sister around the vegetable rows, remembering how the shopkeeper's daughter had once hidden behind her mother's skirts whenever Rebecca entered the store. Hard to believe it's only been 8 months. Jacob's voice came from behind her, warm with the contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. Sometimes it feels like those dark days happen to different people entirely. Rebecca turned to face him, her heart still quickening at the sight of his gentle smile, despite the months they had spent working side by side to build something beautiful from the ashes of hatred and fear. People can change, she said softly. Even when it seems impossible, even when everyone has given up hope. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Martha Henderson had left town quietly after the confrontation at the doctor's office, her influence broken by the public revelation of her lies and manipulation. Without her poisonous voice stirring up fear and resentment, other residents had gradually begun to see the Amish families as neighbors rather than threats. It had started with small gestures. Mrs. Patterson bringing soup when Eli Byler's wife fell ill. Young Tom Bradley asking Samuel for advice about crop rotation. Dr. Williams joining the Amish men for their barn raising when the community decided to rebuild bigger and better than before. Each act of kindness had planted seeds of understanding that bloomed into genuine friendship. The children make it look so easy, Jacob observed, watching the mixed group of youngsters invent a new game that seemed to involve equal parts tag and hide and seek. They don't see differences the way adults do. They just see potential friends. Maybe that's what we forgot as we got older, Rebecca replied. The simple truth that people are just people, regardless of how they dress or worship. Fear makes us forget our shared humanity. The wedding had been the turning point, the moment when two communities truly became one. When Rebecca and Jacob stood before both English and Amish witnesses to pledge their love and commitment, the ceremony itself became a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over prejudice. Samuel had performed the service with quiet dignity, his words speaking of love that transcended differences and faith that built bridges instead of walls. Sheriff Coleman had stood as Jacob's witness, his presence a powerful statement about justice and acceptance. Even Dr. Williams had attended, bringing his wife and daughters to witness what he called the most hopeful thing I've seen in 20 years of frontier life. Do you ever miss your old life? Rebecca asked Jacob, reaching up to touch the simple wooden cross he now wore alongside his wedding ring. The solitude, the freedom from complicated relationships and community obligations. Every day, Jacob said with a grin that took any sting out of his words. Especially when your father assigns me yet another task that requires learning some skill I never knew existed. Rebecca laughed, remembering how Jacob had struggled to master the art of traditional barn construction, his modern techniques clashing with centuries-old Amish methods, until he learned to blend both approaches into something uniquely effective. But, Jacob continued, his voice growing serious, I wouldn't trade this life for anything. This community, this sense of purpose, this feeling that every day matters because we're building something together. And you, of course, most especially you. The words sent warmth spreading through Rebecca's chest, a feeling that had grown stronger rather than weaker during their months of marriage. Love, she had discovered, wasn't just the passionate attraction that had first drawn them together, but also the quiet satisfaction of working toward common goals, and the deep peace that came from being truly known by another person. The territorial representative came by yesterday while you were in town, Rebecca said, changing the subject to more practical matters. He wanted to know if we'd reconsidered his offer to relocate somewhere less challenging. And what did you tell him? Jacob asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. I told him that we'd found our home, Rebecca replied firmly. That challenges are just opportunities to prove what we're really made of, and that running away from difficulty never solved anything worth solving. The truth was that their community had become stronger through adversity, more united in purpose and more committed to their shared values. The attacks and persecution they had faced had revealed what truly mattered, stripping away everything superficial to expose the bedrock of faith and love that sustained them. Besides, Rebecca added with a mischievous glint in her eyes, someone needs to keep teaching the local ranchers how to properly rotate their crops. Half of them still think good farming is just a matter of luck and prayer. Prayer doesn't hurt, Jacob pointed out, but proper soil management definitely helps. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their community go about the business of daily life with the easy rhythm of people who had found their place in the world. Children played while adults worked. Neighbors helped neighbors without regard for religious differences, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. The sound of wagon wheels announced the arrival of the morning mail, delivered by young Tim Bradley, who had taken over the route from his father. The boy waved cheerfully as he approached, his smile evidence of how completely the atmosphere in the area had changed. Morning, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, Tim called out, using the name Rebecca had taken when she married Jacob. Got letters for both communities today, including one that looks official for Mr. Yoder. Rebecca accepted the mail with thanks, noting the territorial seal on her father's letter and wondering what new challenge or opportunity it might represent. Whatever it was, she knew their community would face it together, as they had learned to face everything else. You know what I think? Jacob said as they walked back toward the house where Samuel waited to review the day's tasks and plans. I think we're living proof that the things that make us different aren't nearly as important as the things that make us human. Profound wisdom from a man who once thought conversation with cattle was adequate social interaction, Rebecca teased, earning a gentle nudge from her husband's elbow. Those cattle were excellent listeners, Jacob protested, very non-judgmental, never interrupted, always seemed interested in what I had to say. And now you have an entire community of people who hang on your every word, Rebecca pointed out, especially when you're explaining why the traditional way of doing something might benefit from a few modern improvements. As they reached the house, Rebecca paused to look back at the garden, where her tomato plants continued their patient reach toward the sun. Like those seedlings, their community had grown from small beginnings into something strong and beautiful, something that could weather storms and produce fruit that nourished everyone around it. The lonely girl who had once been bullied for being different had discovered that her differences weren't weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths to be celebrated. The isolated rancher who had once preferred solitude had found that the right community could enhance rather than diminish his independence. And together, they had proven that love really could conquer fear, understanding could triumph over prejudice, and hope could flourish even in the harshest soil. As they entered the house to begin another day of the life they had built together, Rebecca offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The path had been difficult, marked by trials that had tested their faith and challenged their courage, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be. In a territory known for its harsh winters and unforgiving landscapes, they had created something rare and precious, a community where being different was not just tolerated but valued, where authentic love could grow between people who might have been enemies, and where the quiet strength of faith could transform even the most hostile environment into a place of peace and hope. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but unafraid, filled with the promise of children to raise, crops to tend, neighbors to love, and a legacy of acceptance to pass on to generations yet to come. And in that future, Rebecca knew, the lesson they had learned together would continue to bear fruit, that our worth isn't determined by society's judgment, but by our own resilience and the authentic connections we form with those brave enough to see us as we truly are.